I suppose just because I'm not from this area, maybe a quick introduction would be good. I do recognize a few faces, obviously. My name is Ashley Brzezicki. I'm a massage therapist from the East Coast, focused in the Moncton area of New Brunswick. So I haven't met a lot of you yet. So thank you so much for having me. Thank you to Mark and Amanda for inviting me back. I'm really, really grateful to have this time with you. What I want to do today is do a mixture of speech TED Talk style plus a little bit of education. I'm talking about something that I have realized is incredibly important and is not well understood in our profession. So I'm going to start by means of a story. Several years ago, I had a pivotal moment in my massage practice where I recognized that I had a massive blind spot for a very specific subset of my clients. It's a tough story. I'll do my best not to have my heart leap up into my throat when I tell you about what happened. But it's all thanks to the honesty of a client that I understood that the way that I was practicing was insufficient in a very specific category. So several years ago, I was taking in an initial assessment. It's a brand new person. It wasn't a referral. I've never heard of them. I've never met them. They're sitting and waiting in the lobby. I go out, I call their name, they stand up. The very first thing I notice about them is how beautiful their curly hair was. I took it upon myself to give them a compliment. I wasn't thinking to myself, I should preface this by saying that I should have known better by that time. I had already consumed content that said that we really shouldn't comment on people's bodies at all. Just, you don't know what their relationship is with the thing that you're complimenting on. So it's best to stay away from commenting on people's bodies. I thought that hair was a relatively benign thing to comment on, which as it turns out, and you already know I was wrong. So she stands up, we're making eye contact. I said to her, I love your curly hair. And her response to that was a bit of a surprise to me. She broke eye contact with me, looked straight down at the ground and said, thanks, in a really curt, end of conversation kind of way. At this point in time, I'm still ignorant to what I had done. I thought she was just having a bad day. And I was like, whatever, I turn this kind of energy around all the time in the treatment space. We'll figure it out. So she comes into my treatment room. I motion for her to sit down. She takes a seat. We start doing the intake. We start talking about her health history. It's at this point that she tells me, she's honest and says that several months before she was diagnosed with breast cancer. Okay. And then she says, and this is the part where my heart wants to leap into my throat. She says, these aren't my natural curls. These are called chemo curls. For those of you that don't know, chemotherapy can denature the protein of the hair follicle, making the hair come in more wavy and textured. She said, these are chemo curls. I know you didn't mean anything by it. Nobody ever does. But I don't hear a compliment. I hear a reminder that I could have died. Major record scratch moment for me. In that instant, I understood that I had failed at communicating. I understood that I had a blind spot in my practice. It was a really vulnerable moment for both of us. For her, obviously, it was a bid for reconnection. I had threatened the therapeutic alliance. I did it out of ignorance. I didn't know what had happened. And on some level, I'm sure she recognized it, and she was doing what she needed to do to get it back on track. And now the ball was my court. It was my job to give an apology worthy of reconnection. Honestly, that was the easy part. I said, I'm so sorry. You're so right. That was completely ignorant. Thank you for telling me what had happened. I'm going to make sure that I go home and research this. I will make sure to not recreate this situation with anybody in the future. I think because I gave her an adequate apology, that she felt like, okay, she can handle my truth. And so the room was safe again for her to tell me her story. And it's that part that was hard for me. As a person who has their own existential dread, hearing her honesty around what it's like to be to find out that you're critically ill when you're not expecting that, to wonder what your future's going to hold when you're not expecting that. It's not in your frame of reference. Most of us have blinders on. We just go without ever thinking that you're not sure what tomorrow's going to bring. And so as I was sitting there doing my best to try to hold space for her and navigating that with my client, I was also double timing, trying to navigate my own existential dread that was churning up. I decided that I was not well trained enough in how to hold space that way, specifically for the client base where they are critically ill, facing grief, loss, bereavement, death, and dying. And I went forward and took death doula courses. For those that have never heard of the term, death doulas do exist. Exact same concept as birth doulas, other end of life. It's not a registered healthcare profession. Death doulas are non-medical support providers to people. And because of that, I chose to take 3 separate courses, and that I would pull the red thread in between each of them. They're well-respected courses at the very least, even though they don't have a college. Some of them were a couple weekends long, and there were other ones that I took with a medical university out of the States. That one was several weeks long. So what I've decided to do is weave in those teachings. And I'm at the point now where I recognize the value in the lesson that I had learned, that I want to share the message with everybody else, because we really don't do enough to talk about this one specific situation in clinic that can come up for literally any one of us at any time. And that's the message that you already work in death care. You just don't know it yet. Or maybe some of you do. Maybe some of you have considered this, and that's why you're here. But maybe this is a little bit of a reframing for some of you, and I'm glad that you're here to hear the message. So, I do want to extend a little bit of grace to everybody, because on some level we are neurobiologically wired to avoid the conversation around death. It's gritty, it feels hot and sticky, and people don't like it. And that's, on some level, we're always going to deal with a measure of that. But the other thing that's going on is that, and I know this to be true because I have formal education in anthropology. I have a bachelor's and a master's degree in anthropology. And I studied what different cultures do interacting with existentialism, with mortality, with death and dying, with critical illness. And the message around that is that we don't all do it the same. There are some cultures that have a much more fluid conversation around these difficult topics. It's just easier to have open conversation in community spaces around them. Us in the West, we are what is called in the literature to be either death denying or death avoidant. And that comes with its own set of challenges. We do it out of a place where we're trying to keep ourselves safe. It's self-preserving. It's a topic that a lot of us don't like because it makes us feel gross. So out of a place of just self-preservation, we don't want to look at it. But that comes with its cons. It's a strategy that comes with cons. The more we don't look at it, the louder the monster gets in the background. And then all of a sudden, you're faced with a diagnosis and you don't really know what to do with yourself. I want to emphasize to you that death care exists in your spaces right now. And you might be wondering what that looks like for you as a therapist. I'll give you a few examples. So death care can look like you recognizing that there isn't enough miscarriage support out there in the world. And what you want to do for your pregnant clients is create a list of resources, local resources, where in case something happens and they do miscarry, you can hand that list of resources over to that person. You hope that you're never going to have to do that, but it's a compassionate act to prepare that thing. Death care in your practices can also look like you analyzing your own biases and your own narratives around what it means to age, what it means to get sick. Because a lot of people in our culture look at aging as an inherently negative thing. And that's not true to every single culture across the globe. Say you have a client that comes in and they say something that's denigrating about their age and their aging process. And because you're running this subconscious kind of narrative about it, you end up agreeing with them. in some way. And then they walk away thinking, shoot, like, yeah, I knew it. I was right. This is a bad thing. Death care can also look like you challenging the narrative of good vibes only. I've been to a few clinics that have good vibes only written on the wall. I am not a fan. It's not helpful. It's toxic positivity. If you are a person who has a lot of grief and you're walking into a space that says good vibes only written on the wall, on some level, you're not going to feel welcome there. And it's tough. It's a tough headspace to be in. Your dopamine levels have dropped. Your brain chemistry is not the same as it used to be. You're already doing your best. And still on some level, it's not good enough. So that's not a healthy message to send our clients. So all that being said, I do want to share 2 separate strategies that I learned from my death care work, from my death doula courses. So there's going to be one set of strategies that are short-term strategies that you can start using starting today. And then there's a longer strategy, and that will take the rest of your life if you do want to do it the same way that a death doula would. I'm going to share both of them. Obviously, not everybody in this room is going to want to take death doula training, but the reason why I'm sharing the long-term strategy one is because it pays back. I am so much more calm around my own mortality than I would have been had I not done this long-term strategy. It's called a contemplative practice. We'll get into it. So let's talk about communication. I'm going to take the pressure off of you right away. There is no silver bullet that you can tell to your clients who are experiencing grief. There's no right sentence to say that will make them feel any better. So just take the pressure right off yourself, right out the gate. I do want to highlight 3 C's that you can remember. So if you move out of a place of compassion, connection, and community, you're going to be providing better death care than most people. Compassion and connection go hand in hand. You can't really connect truly if you're not compassionate. And you get to practice compassion with connection. So those 2 things go well together. Community, that exists because when people are experiencing grief, they're more likely to isolate themselves. So if you can do something to help them be a part of the community again, have a list of resources. Again, the list of resources is like one of the easiest things you can do. Put gyms in the local area where maybe they have grief talks or bereavement talks. Or maybe there is a mommy and me group. They might be a young mother struggling with grief. You can offer things that help people stay connected to their community. So all of that to say, we don't know the right thing to say. There is no silver bullet. Don't aim for perfection. You're never going to attain it. However, we do have some examples of the wrong things to say. That's a lot easier to identify. Again, 3 examples. If you stay out of sentences that use projection, meaning projecting your own beliefs, stay out of projection, stay out of unsolicited advice. We tend to do that when we're uncomfortable. It's our attempt at making ourselves feel better by giving somebody else unsolicited advice about their grief. It really isn't received well most of the time. And the last thing to stay away from is self-preservation. So that means that you would choose to stay connected at a very superficial level just because you don't want to think about how uncomfortable their grief is. I'll give you some examples. Probably the most common ones that we say, some of you in the room might be like, like I've said that to people before. I just want you to know that I have 2. So most of us are probably in the same boat. So for example, projection. If you say to a client, God never gives you more than you can handle, that's tricky. That's tricky. You might not know that they're atheist. And so if you project your belief system onto them, first of all, it's going to fall completely flat. They're not going to appreciate it. And again, it's the kind of thing where you're projecting what would have felt good for you to hear, right? For you, maybe you have a strong connection with God. And if someone comes to you and says something like that, I mean, that's dependent too, but maybe you would have received that well. Who knows? There is another common phrase that people say, at least they're not in pain anymore. Also tricky. The second you say at least, it's a comparative statement, and you don't want to compare states of living and dying for people's loved ones. Sure, at least they're not in pain anymore, but also I'm still suffering. What do you want? That's how it lands. The last one, and probably the one that I find still happens a fair bit, is I can't imagine what you're going through. I think the intention there comes from a good place. I think you're trying to avoid suggesting that you know exactly what a person is going through. That's fine and that's fair. But take it to an extreme, and what it can sound like is, I don't want to imagine what you're going through. All of us sitting in the room right now, if I say, picture yourself in a hot air balloon with a pink elephant, every single one of us can imagine that. We have that creative power. So it's not that you can't imagine at all what they're going through. It really just mostly is that we really don't want to. It's painful. It would be way too painful for us to consider that to a great detail, what they're going through. So those are just some examples of the most common, the most wrong things to say. We do it out of a good place. We don't mean to hurt people, but because we're so death avoidant in our society, we don't have a lot of conversation about what better things are to say. And so that is obviously what I wanted to share with you. So stay in the 3 C's: compassion, connection, community. Stay away from projection, stay away from unsolicited advice, and stay away from self-preservation. So lack of connecting. So that's the short-term communication strategies. The long-term strategy, the one that ends up paying back, the one that I have grown to love so much, is practicing contemplation. It comes from the 3 Death Doula courses that I was talking about. They're the 3 strategies that helped me stay out of resistance and fear when I considered my own mortality. And instead what I do is I lean into it with curiosity. That's really what it trains you to do. So if you're the type of person that gets spun up with your own existential dread, and because there's not enough community spaces in our communities to talk about these sorts of feelings, right? The only community space I've ever been a part of where such a thing existed was when I was facilitating death cafes with my local hospice. If you're interested in checking something like that out, I highly recommend. What it is a neutral, open, non-judgmental space for people from all walks of life, all ages, all health categories to come and openly discuss what it is to be human, what it is to be vulnerable, what it is to be sick, what it is to grieve. And it's the only example I can think of where we have accepted non-judgmental space in our communities to talk that way, right? Because usually those kinds of conversations are labeled as morbid or bleak, and we think they're inherently negative and we're afraid to participate in them, so we brush them aside. But then that leaves us all to be islands, right? And we're not wired that way. Humans are wired to connect with each other and create emotional bonds. So the contemplative practice, what it entails, it's basically a funneling of, this is where I started anyway, obviously it can get more complicated, but I think where you could start, if you're curious about this, if you're ready to kind of untangle your own biases and narratives around death and dying, it's a set of questions in a very specific order, okay? So the first question is, what scares you the most and why? Be really specific if you can. Just what scares you the most and why? And again, this is like peeling layers off of an onion. I have been doing this for, I didn't know to call it a contemplative practice at the time, but I've been doing this for about 15 years now. I started, I kid you not, as probably one of the most death anxious people I have ever met. The simple mention of death would spin me into a tizzy, and there's been a couple close times where I've almost had panic attacks in my anthropology classes. And I'm no longer triggered in the same way that I used to be. I know how to hold gentle space at this point for the fact that I'm going to die one day. And to me, that doesn't sound wrong anymore, right? It sounds like part and parcel of living. It's not two sides of a spectrum. It's happening at exactly the same time. And I'm okay with that. I'm okay with that now. And I got there by practicing these questions. So what scares you the most and why is the first one. Where does your fear come from? And that's an interesting one. Where does your fear come from? I'll give you an example from my own experience. And bear with me, for some of you might get a little bit churned up inside, but if you need to stand up and take a break and walk out, that's fine. Where does your fear come from? We as children, our brains are like open source code. Anyone can come in there, plug in a little script, and then it's subconscious. We go through the rest of our lives never analyzing where this code came from, where this programming came from. So when I was a kid, I remember every once in a while, my parents would talk about how there's no way in heck that they're ever going to be buried. They'd rather be cremated. And just in the way that they said it, I interpreted that burial must be a bad thing. Right? There's something in it that felt wrong to them. Their tone was off. So I had interpreted it as a bad thing. And so I repeated like a parrot what my parents said about burial. I'm not going to do it. I'd rather be cremated. And it wasn't until I started working on my own contemplative practice that I recognized that actually that doesn't work for me at all. That doesn't work for me at all. I looked into the difference between the two. In cremation, your remains are not useful to organic life. Nothing's going to consume burnt carbon. The energy stored in your body gets burnt up in flame. It transmits into light. It gets blasted off into the cosmos. I'm a homebody. So the concept of me flying through space for all eternity is not for me. I would rather be part of the earth. I would rather that other creatures consume me. I know what it is to be here. I'm comfortable here. And in some way, that for me feels like I'm never going to die. Right? And it wasn't until I started contemplating that, really analyzing where my fears were coming from, that I recognized that didn't belong to me. That belonged to my parents. The next one is, can you do anything to lessen your fear? And the last one is, if you can't, are you willing to accept it? Are you willing to just have a little bit of gentle space for fear to sit at the table? You don't have to kick it out completely. That's what I mean by moving out of resistance. That takes a ton of energy that you could be using on something else. So I hope that with all of this being said, I hope that there is at least a little something in here that sparked your curiosity. I hope that you go forward and consider the fact that as therapists, because we work with living, breathing people, at some point, just statistically speaking, we're going to be in a position where we have to hold good space for death care. That's all I have.